this is going to be the highlight of my night here in the French Riviera. So I will be.
Poor you in the French Riviera. Yeah. Okay. Well, we will give this a whirl, and hopefully, your entire audience doesn't drop off during our presentation. So we've done this one time before, guys. It sort of worked, but we're live today.
Here's the deal. We can talk to each other, right? We will talk to each other, whether anyone's listening or not. So maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but we're going to have a good time.
Oh, yeah, we'll enjoy it.
Yeah, we're not able to do a cold open, but we'll whip something up. I'm sure it'll be fine.
I've got an idea for this, by the way. I think we should follow along with Paul, and we should all be at aspirational locations, right? So, hey, Chris, is my video okay? I don't know if the Wi-Fi is that good here in Aspen. I'm trying to get it to do what it needs, but it's okay. It's working all right. All right.
Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Lockhart. This is Consultants Saying Things. We're doing a very special episode. I'm joined by Oliver Cronk, Phil Yanoff, and Wendy Keem. Some of these faces you may recognize from other parts of the conference. We are doing a double thing today. We're recording an episode of our podcast, but we are also live. And we are live in the business, the Business Innovation Leadership Technology Conference put on by IASA Global. IASAglobal.org. If you've never heard of us before, we are consultants. We say things. We've been doing this podcast for 5 years, something like that. And we talk on a whole range of topics dealing with business, technology, consulting. And so, Paul asked if we could maybe do this, and we'll see how it goes. The topic that we really want to get into. So the conference, just for anyone who is maybe not in the conference and watching this later, the conference is really about driving real world outcomes, primarily with architecture, all different types of architecture. We're going to take a bit of a slant on it and think it through the lens of consulting, right? Because that's kind of where our expertise lies. Although, to be fair, I mean, look at the people on the screen. These are Renaissance people, for those of you who do not know. But at any rate, thank you. So, guys, first of all, I wanna do a shout out. I want to get your perspective real quick on outcomes. Whether it's architecture from an IT technology perspective, or architecture from sort of like a business perspective, or whatever it might be. What's your quick hot take on outcomes? Specifically through consulting, if you can put that lens on it, but generally speaking, how are we looking at outcomes? What do we think about that? Oliver, take a spin at it if you don't mind.
All right, okay.
Throw you into the fire.
Yeah, sure. I have two quick ones to kind of go through. One is outcomes as a consultant and as a consultancy. Do they always align with the client's outcomes? That's an interesting one to sort of ponder, right? What's good for the consulting firm may not always be what's good for the client. And what's good for the client may not be what's good for the consulting firm. So something to sort of bear in mind, depending on what side of the equation you're on. And I think, I've dipped in and out of the sessions that have already been on the conference today. And what's really interesting was the one just now talking about the risk mitigation. And it's almost the outcomes that were avoided are sometimes as valuable when it comes to sort of architecture consulting as the things that are tangibly delivered. And that has been a constant struggle for me in enterprise architecture roles and technology strategy roles and consulting roles, is how do you kind of make explicit the value you're providing? Because often it is in the risk mitigation, the avoidance, those things that aren't as concrete and tangible, but they're super, super important and valuable.
I love this topic so much. We haven't done this one specifically, but it occurs to me, right? This is the entire reason why we exist as consultants, is to deliver outcomes, right? People don't usually pay us to come, go to meetings, just opine on stuff. So it's really our job to deliver, right? So love the topic. And I also think that we can help to embed that spirit of delivering things with employees as well. And it's also our job to share observations, recommendations when maybe things look like they're going off track, right? We are the ones really keeping the eye on the ball and delivering.
What are behaviors of consultants? What do we see? What have we experienced? And what is good and what is maybe less helpful when we are consulting with clients and trying to get to outcomes, right? By the way, I think there's just my quick thing on this. I think there's a tendency to maybe go too far into the weeds sometimes, right? And not be able to see the forest for the trees. But I'd be curious, what are some good behaviors, or when we're talking about outcomes, and maybe what are some not so good ones?
I think you've touched on one already, right? And I think this has come up as well in some of the previous sessions for those that have been on the conference, for the whole thing, like overly fixating on the solution and like going straight to what the answer is, rather than actually spending a bit of time to actually really do discovery. I think discovery phases on projects are often pushed aside. No, let's just get straight on with delivering value and delivering outcomes. But for me, actually, often you need to do the discovery to go, actually, is this thing that you're looking to do even the right thing? Is that thing over there actually the thing that you need to do first? Or what actually makes sense for your organization? And I know Paul Courtbit at the opening of this conference was talking about generative AI, and I'm going to be talking about AI in my slot after this one. And it is interesting how people are getting caught up in the hype of right, I'm going to get some consultants in to deliver this widget or this kind of new shiny thing. And actually, take a step back. What are the outcomes that you're looking to solve? And let's do discovery around what the problems are, the pain points. Because actually, some of my work recently in sort of emerging technology, you often find there are some problems. There is some process stuff to unlock. There's some data problems. There's something that's going to like fundamentally prevent the shiny thing from being deliverable. So let's do some discovery and tease out requirements and take a step back if you can. If you've got the kind of ability to influence and say, let's look at the bigger picture before we go, and zoom in to what we think the answer is.
So, Phil, I mean, what do you, when you're thinking of behaviors, when you're thinking of consulting and trying to get to outcomes, what are some good sort of general behaviors that we would expect to see people following? I know you've done lots of things over the years, right? If I'm not mistaken, didn't you create OS2 Warp? Do I have that wrong?
No, but I met that guy. I've met those guys that worked on that team. No, but I think if we think about like where things go wrong, right, in the big consulting projects that we worked on, for me, it's always because we didn't ask the right questions. Right? We didn't ask enough questions. We didn't ask the right questions. And I think, I think we can be sort of action oriented, right? We can say, what I really like is Oliver was saying, like, we really want to get into this. We want to get this thing done. I want to move forward. And I'm so biased towards activity that I really didn't decide what the right thing to do was at the beginning. I didn't ask the question. I didn't query. I didn't get in. Here's the thing. There's all these layers of what's going on, and I think that's kind of where we got started on this idea. Is that if we don't probe deeper, if we don't get what's underlying, we might actually end up solving. Or I'm sorry, we're going to attempt to solve the presenting problem, the surface problem, and it's probably not the actual problem at all.
I can only be unanimous here with Oliver and Phil. Exactly the same thing I was thinking, and especially the bias for action and solutioning. What was going through my mind is some massive projects I've been involved in that were never really well defined, but literally there were hordes of consultants and people rallying around the solution. And just how precarious that is, because as good as it feels in the beginning to be doing something and doing something fast, it does fall apart at the end. So slow down to speed up, as you're both saying, ask the right questions. The outcomes really, really start there.
Where do people get into trouble? Oliver, we mentioned it, right? Going too far into the weeds, the bias for action over planning and asking the right questions. Are there other things? Not forming relationships comes to mind, right?
Yeah,
Me,
yeah. Right? I think also not being conscious of your biases as well. Like maybe you've seen this problem 50 times in your career and you think the answer for this client is X. Actually, no, in this instance, there's some context that you're missing, or there's a new development, or actually you need to sort of be conscious that you are always biased towards a particular platform or a particular methodology, and there's actually sort of you need to listen. So I think the listening skills, I mean, it comes back to discovery and they're asking the right questions, but then actually listening to folks. Because I think one of the things I've seen as well is consultants can come in and go, okay, well, we'll do a bit of due diligence, a bit of digging, and then they don't fundamentally listen to the people that live in the business day in, day out and actually understand what the core problems are, because people haven't really taken it on board, or they think that they know better. So I think that's definitely something to watch out for, is that sort of bias or that kind of assumption that the people in the business already are wrong. No, maybe there's some better ways of improving things, but you need to be sort of open-minded and check your biases.
So when you're talking about biases, Oliver, are you saying that we can't solve this problem with Lotus Notes? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Yeah, pretty much.
All right. This time I'll let you get away with that.
The greatest email client since Eudora Light. Man, that's fantastic.
And the dog agrees.
Wendy, what are you thinking, Wendy?
Yeah, I also think missing the human side of change is where we go wrong, right? Focusing a lot on what we're doing, what it's going to look like, the sort of the hard side of it, but the human side of change doesn't really come later. It needs to come right up front and really be a factor in part of the whole journey.
That's a culture thing, isn't it, Wendy? I mean, I remember I've worked with people and I've thought the technology absorption rate of this organization is not the same as another organization. And if we don't get that culture piece of this right, that's another way this just goes wrong.
Yeah, I love that listening bit, right? Because, how often do you encounter, look, you can have really smart people. Oftentimes they know they're really smart, right? And it's sort of like, you're sitting in the room and it's like, the answer to your problem is X. I've seen it 1,000 times. I don't even need to ask the questions or I don't need to interview anybody. I know the answer is snowflake or whatever it is, right? And I think so often, there's that, this idea of I've got to show results. I've got to get to the results. The results will speak for themselves. And I think, look, it's show me what you can do. Show me the money, right? Yes, results do matter. But I think there's also you've got to take people along the journey with you, right? Because if you're just sort of, not emoting, right? And you are just, I've just got to the end. Here's the answer. It's self-evident, right? But for a lot of people, it's like, no, they want to be held by the hand and led on a journey, right?
And
isn't that why you were there? I mean, just sorry, Oliver, and a little past you, but isn't that why you were there as a consultant to begin with? I mean, you're probably going to take them to a place they could get on their own, but they wanted to go faster. They wanted to go with more certainty. And that's what your role is in this thing, is to ask them questions, stand close to them, help them figure those pieces out. Sorry, Oliver.
No, not at all. The thing I was going to say is, building on what Wendy was saying about the kind of the people-based change and what you've just both been saying, is that propensity to kind of just overly focus on, particularly in technology architecture and in projects with any element of technology involved in the delivery, is overly kind of worry about that technology piece, because people think it's the hardest part of the problem. But actually, in my experience, it's the implementation and getting hearts and minds, because I find the project team forms this bubble, right? They go through this journey of understanding the problem, coming up with a solution, and then they're sort of sold. And the danger is they get drunk on their own, kind of high on their own supply, as it were, and they don't have empathy for the fact they're then delivering this thing into a wider organization. And then often things sort of fall apart because they fixate on just getting the thing working technically, and they don't give enough focus to actually the kind of outcomes and embedding this. And one of the things that really resonated for me early on in my consulting career is the change curve. Hopefully I'll probably get it wrong, but there's a sort of change curve of which I think is applied to sort of human emotion around kind of grief, but there's a similar thing around change that a lot of teams just don't recognize, that when you're trying to like shove something new in people's faces, that they will react, and it will take time, and people will react differently. And there isn't enough. If you want to get outcomes, I think there isn't. And I totally agree with Wendy. There isn't enough attention paid to how is this thing going to land, and how do I make sure it's adopted, whether that's training, whether that's comms, whether that, whatever that takes. And I think I learned that one painfully in my technology career, was overly focusing on the thing rather than how the thing is going to get used and landed with the organization.
Would you call that the people problem?
I was going to say, I mean,
it's a great book on this.
Inside joke. I wrote a book 7 years ago called The People Problem. It's available on Amazon.com. It's on my bookshelf back here. But that's not the point of it. It's not shameless self-promotion. But I actually was going to plug, Wendy, your book. In your book, you know, which I'll let you plug on your own here in a second, but in your book, you talk about how to institutionalize some of the things that Oliver was just talking about, right? Which is, you know, how do you institutionalize that change mentality, specifically in your case, dealing with business architecture and other things. But, you know, there's this concept that, like, if when you walk into a room, if there's 10 people, 2 of them are going to probably agree with you, right? 5 are definitely never going to agree with you, kind of thing. And you've got like, you've got to convince them somehow. And then you got people in the middle that are like, yeah, I'll listen to a good story. And if you don't make that connection, you're not going to get the outcome you're looking for, right?
Yeah, indeed. And the strategy to reality, right? How do we turn strategy into reality? And for example, looks like this. Thanks, Oliver. But
award-winning. Can we say that? Award-winning?
It is award-winning. Yes. But you know, why this is so important is it's about the whole cycle of change and how all teams work together hand in hand to get idea into action. And I think, as I talk about in the book, another place where we go wrong is there's sort of this big gap between big ideas and concepts and outcomes we want and how we actually respond to that with coordinated execution, right? We often do that response in silos, and that's where we build duplication and fragmented experiences and things like that. So, of course, we all know that the architecture helps people to have a common understanding of where we're going and align strategy and execution, but just even the people working together as one cohesive muscle is tremendously important.
Bill, you didn't write a book, but did you write a red book back in the day?
I don't know what that is. I don't even know what that is. You know, but I think, you know, Wendy's got this, you know, exactly right. I mean, and you kind of go, as you walk in an organization, where you just kind of see all of these differences. And sorry, let me, I think in that you got to figure out, how am I going to bring these people along? You know, and that's kind of where you started, Chris. It's kind of the people problem. And we talked about technology absorption rates and all of the rest of that. But I think this is, how am I going to get these folks to come with me? Because, you know, I've always said it, you might be able to solve a problem, but if everybody's unhappy at the end of the day, you haven't solved the problem, right? You've got to get this into the culture.
God, you just described my life, Phil. Nobody's happy. But let's think about this for just a second, right? Which is you're leading someone to the outcome that you, as the consultant in this case, believe is the right answer after, presumably, like Oliver, you said, you've done all the due diligence, you've asked all the questions, Phil, you've asked the right questions, right? And now you're leading them on this journey, holding them by the hand. What if they still don't want to go there? What if your outcomes are sort of different from what the client is expecting, right? What do we do then? How do we get past that? Because I think that's real, right? I mean, happened to me, I know.
I mean, isn't that where you go ask more questions? And what I mean by that in this case, right, is that, you know, I think if you're taking the steps and everybody agreed to this, right, you feel like you got agreement on the front end, and then it's just not going where you thought. I mean, this is where you stop and go, I'm confused. I thought this is where we were headed, but I could have gotten it wrong. And I'm willing to have you restate this to me, because I feel like this is your journey. I am here, you know, don't forget, I'm not Luke, I'm Obi-Wan. I'm here to help you win this thing, right? I'm here to help you defeat this problem. I thought this is where we headed. What is it you think we were really setting off to do?
You're Yoda. Stop. You're not Obi-Wan. You're Yoda.
Yoda. Just do the green.
I mean, what do you think, Oliver? I know we've talked about this before, right? Outcomes are misaligned.
Yeah, I mean, I touched on it right at the beginning, right? I think there is that kind of commercial misalignment piece, but then there is also the solution misalignment. I mean, I've worked in a number of situations where there's been a team that's been adamant that they want to continue using the legacy technology that they're using because it's all they've ever known in their career, and persuading them to quite scarily move on from that platform that's, I suppose, a bit of a comfort blanket for them, and embrace something newer because it offers the business new capabilities, for example, is often a hard sell, because you're asking people to take a leap into the unknown, and it's not just a project for them, it's their career that you're potentially meddling with. So it comes back to that kind of human dimension again. I think it's kind of making sure that you're as transparent as possible and trying to take people on that sort of journey without sounding corny. I guess there are some times where you have to escalate this stuff, right? Depending on what grade you are, if you're not a partner or a senior kind of director in a consulting organization, you may have to escalate this up and say, I think we need to have you need to have a higher ups conversation with the buying client, and get agreement from above, because it's not working at the level that I'm operating at. So, so hopefully you don't have to go there, but that is an option, and sometimes that's what's needed. It's not a scary sort of nasty thing to do. It's actually, let's make sure this project is going to go in the right direction and isn't just a complete utter waste of time and money for everyone here. So let's make sure we are aligned on what the outcomes need to be.
One of the ways that I've done this in the past, and it's tactical, so I'm not answering the larger question around alignment and all that sort of stuff, but every major meeting or every status report or every steering committee, especially, right, reminding people what our objectives are, right? What business problem did you hire us to help solve? Here's what we all agreed on 6 months ago when we started this, right? And doing that every week at a certain point, everyone either agrees or they don't agree, but no one can say that you weren't trying to bring people along, right? And it's very simple to do, right? And slide deck. But so things may be misaligned. There's probably a way to get them there. But so how do we as consultants, how do we then balance sort of maybe what the client wants, right? Maybe what we sold in the statement of work, in the proposal, right? Versus what's achievable, right? Or, because things can change as a project goes along, right? And when we're talking about outcomes, is it possible that the desired outcomes are going to change throughout a project?
Yeah, most certainly. And we know, especially on really big efforts, right? Things can evolve and change as people are learning and as they go. I mean, from a consulting perspective, of course, we have important things agreed to on paper. And sometimes those things have to get updated, right? And agreed to. To the earlier conversation, we might even be the ones that step up and bring people together and help them align on where we're going. But balancing, part of your question brings me back to some very important conversations that we all had around balance and consultants and things like that. And if we do get in a situation where what the client wants is excessive, right, to try to achieve versus what we can deliver on, I think those are real good, important heart-to-heart conversations to talk about what we can do, how we get creative, and helping everybody, right, to see the bigger picture of, we can work really hard and deliver on this thing, but burn all our people out, or we can go at this at a very sustainable pace and really keep at it and deliver better for longer. So some hard conversations.
I agree. And Phil, I think you sort of mentioned it earlier, right? That's what you're there to do, right? Is to help them craft decisions based on options that maybe they're not thinking about or thinking through.
Yeah, and the thing is, none of this. I was thinking about how Wendy was talking about this, but none of this is an assurance that there won't be a misstep somewhere along the way, right? I mean, it just happens. I mean, and I think about a big project that I was involved, and a requirement got missed, and it was just. And by the way, it was very much to be that thing. It was in that spot where Wendy was talking about, where we were kind of wearing out the team. And therefore, when an important meeting came up, someone was so fatigued that they were out of the space when they needed to be in the space in an important meeting. And so a requirement gets missed. You go down, you get your way down towards implementation and find out you're going to miss the date. It's going to cost $800,000 more than it was going to when you got started. And I think the pacing thing can be a problem. We got to figure out how you're going to pace the people and what you're going to ask of them, and give yourself space. Again, I think that's kind of that action-oriented thing. We can kind of get ourselves in spots like, I really need to be pedaling as fast as I can because look at my billing rate. I really have to prove that I am worth every dollar of this. And I think that you can sometimes just get that wrong. I've certainly seen it go wrong. But back to Wendy on this, I think. Here's my question, right? So there is a misstep. Something happens in this space. You get a thing wrong. What is your ideas about how you reset expectations? What's the pattern for getting that back on track, right? The wheels have come off the wagon. You got to get them back on. Well, hold on a second. I got to get another metaphor in there. No, I just won't use that one.
Talking of the wheels coming off the wagon, we lost you earlier. I fear we've lost Chris because he's frozen for me. I don't know about anyone else.
Yes,
yeah, don't forget the audience can't see him, so it's just better for them. We'll just keep going. Wendy,
sorry, I've just unveiled. Yeah, I've just done a reveal there. Anyway, yeah. Sorry, you were doing an amazing job of keeping it going, so I'll shut up.
Absolutely. Phil, I have two thoughts. Oliver would love to hear yours as well. One is when hard things happen, and I'm saying this not as some saying, this is really what I do and do with my team. That is a great opportunity to use it to show who you are, how you handle hard situations, and build a stronger partnership. So you own it, you take it, you recover, right? And you do the right thing, whatever it may be. The other thing is just trying to really prevent or smooth out those things. So like strong partnership, great communication, right? True human stuff to head off so that if something happens or something's missed, it doesn't feel so drastic and it doesn't feel so sort of finger pointing. So just really keeping that connection so we can all weather it together.
I love that, Wendy. And I think what you're talking about talks about building a true sort of enduring partnership between consultancy and client. And it depends what kind of environment, I guess, what kind of culture you have as a consultancy as to whether it's sort of short-term focused and pressurized to kind of, I suppose, kind of win work, do it and then move on to the next thing, or actually whether there is the culture that allows for that, respectful, listening, enduring kind of relationship building. And I totally agree with you, Wendy, around the point that when things get difficult, that's when people really show their colors. And I think if you're able to kind of be flexible, and I think this is both sides. People watching this won't all be in consulting. There'll probably be a balance of people on the consulting side and people on the client side as well. And I think it's sort of knowing and showing a bit of empathy for the other side. And yeah, and I think that's building those true partnerships is how you get the best results. Because unfortunately, I see way too much of, you're the supplier. This is your problem. You now need to deal with this. I don't care if it's beyond scope, whatever. And unfortunately, that then creates problems that then will surface elsewhere. I think if there's a bit of give and take and a bit of pragmatism, that goes a long way to kind of making sure that you get the results that you want. Because ultimately, everyone wants to sort of do the right thing. And I think if you get sort of sharkish, short-termist behavior, that's when reputations start to get damaged for sure.
I'm not sure I buy the idea that everyone wants to do the right thing, but it's a nice place to start.
I like to live in that world.
Yeah. So I like this whole line of thinking, and let me ask you, Oliver. So, and I got two pieces. I want to make sure we get to both. But one of them is from your standpoint, right? What does the mea culpa look like, right? You've had the misstep. You're doing that thing. I mean, and Wendy kind of gave us the broad setting of it, right? But there's something really, from a tactical standpoint, how do you execute the mea culpa and get it back to where you want it to be? What does that look like?
I think it's being open and honest and transparent. I think the worst thing I see people doing is trying to bury it. Or go, can we just sort of sort this out?
Defensively bearing it, yeah.
Yeah, can we just sort of work some extra hours and sort of sort this thing out and make it go away? And I actually think having the brave conversation with whoever is on the other side to say, do you know what, we need to flag this. I mean, you need to use your judgment, right? Because sometimes these things can be fixed and you can course correct behind the scenes. But if there is something that's a significant risk or there has been a mistake made, And I guess the classic one of these is probably things like security breaches that I see, where perhaps there has been the mishandling of data or something like that on an engagement. You just got to be open and honest and fess up to that and work with the other side to kind of make sure that it's dealt with appropriately. And I think that for me is kind of, and when I see how people behave in that moment, it's like what Wendy was saying. You really understand how people really are, and I think the worst thing is you then to try and explain why you weren't transparent. And the problem for me is it just gets worse and worse the longer you kind of leave that conversation. So just face into those difficult conversations, and I think things are a lot easier to kind of manage.
Yeah, I love that, being direct and addressing it right. I mean, we'd all like to look away. If situational avoidance worked, we'd all be doing this all the time, right? But it's really not the way to go about this, because we just can't make this work. I mean, it just, the problem gets bigger, and you end up with just bigger problems later. And I think you're pointing to that perfectly. I want to ask Wendy one piece of this, and we're going to toss this back and let Chris get us back online. But Wendy, a thing that I've noticed about the little bit of stuff that you and I and Chris and Oliver do together is you inject such positivism into our stuff, and really, quite frankly, where it's not warranted, right? But I mean, you do such a nice job of being such a nice person and being so easy to get along with that I'm sitting there thinking, like, is this a flex? I mean, is she like doing a thing so that like when things go wrong, it's all going to be okay? Because we're all like, everyone loves Wendy Keene. That's what we're going to say about this. I mean, I'm going to guess you can't be that way with just us. You must be this way everywhere you work. I mean, do you have like some life guidance that you could give us all so that we wouldn't be, regarded as the people we are and more like you?
This is not true. None of this is true, but you are making me laugh. I love it. You know what? It honestly comes from a belief system, which I think is maybe maybe it's useful, right? Maybe it's working. It's a belief in, for example, things iterating. Things take time, right? We're humans. We never get it right. We never get it done, right? So, in just kind of appreciating the whole growth of all of us, wherever we are on a trajectory. And I think the other thing is just being about a purpose, right? Whatever that purpose is, and just kind of letting knowing that the personal stuff and being okay, whether that's a consulting firm or individuals, it's going to sort out if we do the right thing. So, Bill, I don't know that I've said anything useful, but I do think it's how you think about things is where the thoughts come from anyway. And by the way, in hard situations like this, right? In hard situations like this, I think it's an important belief system to have if something goes wrong.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think it just plays really well. And I'm just going to cap this off by saying that you're nicer to us than we deserve most of the time. So.
No, it's not true.
It's 100% true. Positive mental attitude, right? I think that matters. It just, so let me take it in a slightly different direction, right? Because oftentimes, especially management consultants, get a bad rap, right? For everything's going to be fine, everything is wonderful, right? There's a lot of smoke and mirrors and hand waving going on. Strategy.
Is that the sales team or the consulting team? Is it the sales side or the consulting side that you're
we're all in sales, right? But so unfettered optimism is everything's, the status on everything's green all the time except when it's red, right? Is there like a need to maybe have a different level of detail, or like maybe it's a different mental approach depending on the audience that you've got, like who you're speaking to, whether it's a client or like peers, or because you're always going to encounter those super negative people at clients, right?
No, I think there is something in what you're saying about adapting to different situations and different stakeholders. But I think for me, it comes back to sort of empathizing, and it's really hard. I think for me, it's one of the hardest things to do is to put myself in other people's shoes and think like, what's going on in their world? What's their perspective on what we're putting forward? I think that's a tricky thing, because as a consultant, you often have to have quite a bit of confidence and gumption about kind of entering difficult situations and presenting and formulating answers and being on the hook for things. Sometimes I think you can get a little bit lost in that in that, and we've talked about ego on the on the show before. It's kind of understanding when there is the time for you to kind of pull something out of a hat and come up with an answer, and when it's time to listen, sit back and actually and almost sort of mentor or kind of guide someone to give you, what they're perhaps not saying, but they really need to say in a particular situation. So, yeah, it's not easy, and that's why I don't think it's the consulting role is for everyone, because some people are just really good individual contributors and good at their craft, but they can't sort of take that step outside of what they're doing and understand how it relates to other parts of a project. And
so it sounds like you're saying they're losing the forest for the trees kind of thing, right? I mean, what is the right level of detail? Because obviously, you can't be super detailed in everything all the time, but you also, can't be Pollyanna, right? Up in the clouds, right? What's the right level of detail?
And that's a really interesting question for this conference as well, right? Because you'll have enterprise architects on here, you'll have solution architects on here, technical and domain and security, kind of particular problem areas. And I think this is often the challenge as an architecture profession and as an architecture consultant is, how much am I operating at this sort of big picture level? How much am I zooming down? And I think for me personally, the biggest challenge I have now is, how much do I devote my time to general industry trends type stuff, or individual sort of technology things that are going on, like the AI stuff that everyone's talking about right now? It's kind of, understanding when to zoom in and when to zoom out is again a really difficult skill. And as Wendy says, we're human and we're not always going to get that balance right. For me, I seesaw between going super detailed on something over here and then spending some time kind of working on my communication skills, the next week. And it's hard, and it's almost like you're making bets at a casino table, right? I'm putting all my chips on this area of focus this week or today, and tomorrow I'll maybe move those chips somewhere else.
I think Oliver, just to echo, I think empathy is so huge here, and understanding who I'm talking to, what they care about, what is relevant to them, and like this consultant ability to tailor and flex and up, zoom in and zoom out. I think the other thing that will guide is also context, and it might sound obvious, right? But if we're in the beginning of doing something, right, the conversations are higher level. What are the big rocks? What are the big decisions? Are we on board with where we're going? Like, let's not zoom down to the nth, degree, just enough, just in time. And just even for people that are detailed, being able to hold back and say, like, no, really, what do we need to do right now? More is going to come later.
I find that interesting, right? Because it's like, not everyone's able to do that, right? For example, who could have predicted that Phil would just get up and walk away right there, right? For example.
He's had enough. Finally, after 5 years of doing the podcast, that's it. He's
had enough. He's out of here.
Too much.
He's out of here. Leave the puppy.
It's the puppy. It's I like this, but I think I've got a technique for this, and I want to just posit this, and I want you to reject it. I want you to tell me where I'm wrong. Right? Here's my theory, and this is the way I've learned to deal with this. I'll look at a client who wants something from me, a proposal, an answer, a thing like that, and I'll say, let's just imagine that this thing is going to do exactly what you wanted to do, and we're going to write something out for you. What needs to be on there to solve that problem? What is it you need to see in this bit? What does this look like? And like they're going to push back a little bit or something. But no. I said, here's the deal. We both want this to be successful, right? So I'm writing this proposal for you. What needs to be in here? What do you need to see in order to understand it? And then they'll tell you a thing. It's like, well, at what level of detail is that? How does that work? And you can even, maybe they know the right answer, but maybe you can even push back on that bit of it, right? And say, oh, wait a second. Okay, how did you come by that? I really think questioning is part of this. I know Chris keeps going, Phil, the Socrates, stop it. But I'm just saying that if you
are you going to mention Epictetus yet? I mean,
I'm not doing any of that. But I'm telling you, if you do this right, you can get the client to write the proposal. You can practically get the client to write the proposal, and that's kind of where you want to be.
I like that, Phil, in a much less interesting way than you said. I also like to say, what questions need to be answered, right? Let's not sort of jump around and guess what questions need to be answered. Let's use that to focus.
Yeah, and that requires, I think, that ability to lead a client to something, right? Because oftentimes one of the reasons you're there as a consultant is they may have the answer somewhere in their head, but they can't get it, right? They can't get it out. And you're there to help them. So, I mean, when we're talking about outcomes, a valuable outcome frequently is just getting the damn thing articulated in the right way, right? I think it's interesting because not how many places have you been where like they think the problem is X, but the problem is really Y, right? And they don't know it until you get into it with them.
It comes back to what we were talking about right at the beginning, right? Is understanding what the situation and the context is before you dive straight into something, because all too often the sexy shiny project is not achievable until you uncover the kind of dependencies that you're going to need to kind of make sure are in place, or you at least need to manage expectations of what's achievable. If some of the kind of what I describe quite often is this sort of technology archaeology, or you could call it architecture archaeology if you want to kind of look at other parts of the architecture stack than just tech. But what things are there that what the layers of decisions and systems and processes and data that are there that most people don't realize are then going to trip you up when you come to actually deliver something. But Chris, there's an interesting angle we got in the notes here around that architects often don't see their thing come to fruition. That is a really interesting angle for me around, and I think it applies to consulting as well. Often you will design a program or you will do a operating model or something, and then you won't ever see that thing necessarily see the light of day. And I think that is perhaps an interesting angle to sort of think about as well.
Yeah. And by the way, I don't think you have to be an architect, right? Consultants frequently don't see the thing that they've poured hundreds of hours into come to fruition because you've moved on to another project or whatever. So I'm kind of wondering, right, about this. Is like, are these things like that we've been talking about, getting to outcomes, helping guide clients, understanding your audience, all of this stuff, right? Are these things that people can learn? Or are these things that, like, if you don't have it, it's not, consulting is not for you?
I think you get burned and then you learn. Would be my slightly negative, perhaps, view of this one. I think if you don't sort of realize these things, you will over time, for sure. And I think
you just burn out.
Or just I see people transitioning into consulting from perhaps client roles, and they even make that transition, and sometimes they'll quickly adapt and learn the different approaches that they need to take, or they will see sort of painful things happen that they'll learn from, and hopefully they course correct and learn. If they don't, then they probably won't last in the gig very long.
It's like eating at a restaurant does not teach you to run a restaurant, right? So buying from a consultant does not teach you to be it looks so easy. Here's the deal, Oliver. You get you or Wendy or Chris in there. It looks easy. You guys make doing a hard job look easy. And then they go, oh, could I come work with you guys? Because I think I'd be great at this. And it just doesn't transfer that way. It's all of that stuff that's going on behind of, again, figuring out what the pieces are, being able to communicate. All of those pieces are not normally something that someone has to do unless you're in the consulting side of this.
Well, and the corollary to that, right, is just because you're an expert at something doesn't mean you're going to be a good consultant, right? And a lot of people, frankly, I think consulting firms do themselves a disservice by intentionally recruiting for like experts in a particular area. It's like, great, this person knows everything about, large language models and all this sort of stuff, but they can't carry on a conversation with another human being, and you want to use them as a consultant, right? Like, that seems like a really terrible idea. No, stick them in a room someplace and whatever they're going to generate, but you still got to have that ability to communicate that idea. And I think we've talked about this before when we talked about storytelling and some other things, right? And I think it's so critical. And I don't know how you get to outcomes without that, right? Without being able to communicate that. So there we go. It's like you have to ask the right questions. You have to understand the problem, right? These aren't technical skills we're talking about.
I was going to go there, actually. I think you do need to be quite adaptable, and I'm not sure everyone is. It's a bit like we talked about the change curve earlier. Some people can go through that quicker than others, and some people kind of get stuck. And it takes them longer to sort of handle a difficult situation or opposing sort of situation. I honestly think there are people that are more flexible and more, I suppose, suited to consulting and architecture, quite frankly, because I see architects often as internal consultants in a lot of cases. Some of the best architects I've ever worked with have kind of applied that sort of mentality to how they work. And I think that's fine. Not every job is for everyone. And to your point about the subject matter expert thing, I see that in the architecture space as well. Just because you're an amazing senior engineer, and unfortunately, HR, in order to promote you, to retain you in the organization, is going to give you an architect title so that you can get an increase in salary. And this is where I see so many organizations get it wrong. That doesn't work. It doesn't necessarily mean you're good as an SME, you're going to be a good leader, or you're going to be a good manager. The same sort of thing applies. So it's as whether you can be an architect, because it does require different skills, and it's identifying, does someone have the aptitude and show the potential, and that's the people that should be kind of put in those sort of roles. But it's a tricky one, because I don't believe people are fixed either. Like I don't honestly think that there are certain people that can't make that shift. It's how easy it is maybe for them to make the shift versus them not being able to make that shift at all. Are they prepared to put the work in and be self-aware and think about what they need to change in order to be good at that new thing they want to do? If they're not, then they're not going to work out. But it doesn't mean that they couldn't. It's just they didn't put in enough work.
Well, honestly, I think some of it takes the courage to think differently and slow people down, particularly when there's dollars and pressure on the line. I guess you could just look at yes, you're right. A lot of these succeed or kind of succeed and bump along and get there. But I think it's just, we have an opportunity to get people to think differently and think differently up front, really.
The classical architecture answer is it depends, right, Chris? And everything we've talked about is very, I suppose, hypothetical and conceptual. And the thing about architecture and consulting is it very much depends on the context and the situation, because you can be working on some really grand plan to reimagine the operating model, which requires lots of careful consideration and thought and discovery, or you can be brought in on a specific engagement to make a very specific thing happen, and therefore you have to flex and change your style accordingly. I don't think there's a one size fits all to outcomes. And you ask, is there another way? Yeah, there is. The senior person says this thing just needs to happen. I'm not going to consult or engage with anyone. I've brought this consultancy in to just make this new platform, come in the next 3 months. And if anyone questions that, they're going to get fired, right? And I know that that's probably more compatible with my understanding of the US, where I've worked with US firms, than it is with Europe, because you can't get away with doing the fire thing so much in Europe. But we look at the Jeff Bezos memo, the kind of famous one that says, you will create service-orientated interfaces for your components of Amazon, or you'll be fired. That's the other way you get the outcome. And he got a very composable e-commerce platform, and AWS and various other things off the back of that as well. So yeah, there are a multitude of different ways of getting the outcome. Just depends on how much collateral damage you're prepared to suffer along the way.
Well, this is really interesting. You've introduced sort of a concept I wasn't really thinking of, and is, by the way, nowhere in our notes. And I'm just scanning here, right? Which is, the outcome, also getting outcomes also depends on, not burning people out, right? Which is like, there's a human element to getting outcomes. Getting good outcomes as a consultant or an architect is not just about getting the answer. It sounds like what we're saying is it's getting the answer in the right way, or maybe it's a sustainable way, Oliver. I don't know. I know you have a session coming up on sustainability. I thought I'd plug it.
Yeah. No, that's it, isn't it? Are you looking for a short-term outcome, a short-term fix, or are you looking for something that's going to be sustainable and take people on that journey? For sure. Yeah, I think that's at the heart of what we're talking about here. You can be ruthless, and you can kind of rip up stuff and create a lot of chaos and uncertainty along the way, or you can kind of tread a little bit more carefully in a more considered way. And I guess it depends on what's appropriate. If your organization is a life and death sort of situation, and you absolutely need to make a change, or the organization's not going to exist in 3 to 6 months, then kind of whether you upset people or not is kind of a little bit of a moot point, because I think the key thing is to explain, be transparent. I see so many organizations, like the leadership team, just doesn't actually communicate the real reason for like the sudden urgency to make a change. Like, just people understand when you're like transparent and honest with them. Like, tell them why. Don't just think that you're above everyone else and that like this thing just needs to happen and they just need to get along with it. Yeah, a bit of context helps.
There's something that Phil that you always say, which I think is a good way to sort of begin to wrap this, which is, you talk about like trying to be a good human, right? Or maybe I'm paraphrasing, right? Or don't have it quite right, but it sounds to me, I mean, honestly, when we started having this conversation, like so many of our conversations, honestly, I wasn't thinking about this aspect at all, but maybe part of this getting good outcomes means you got to be a good human, or try to be, at least during the process. What do you think about that?
No, I want to do that all the time. I'd like to think that other people want to do that some of the time as well, right? But I think that for us to flourish in this role of being the trusted advisor to some other organization and helping them solve problems, that one of the things we have to do as a good human is, we want to be sympathetic to their panic, whether it's real or imagined, but we don't want to embrace it and embody it. I mean, it is not for us to live that out. So, nobody really, and the thing is, they don't really want that. They might even think they want that, but that's not really what you want to do. And I think it is completely okay to think of yourself as, okay, they're looking for help and they must think that I can do it. So let's go ahead and have that conversation. And I am going to be sympathetic to their idea that they want urgency, but I'm going to ask questions and I'm not going to be in a big hurry. I'm going to make sure they get taken care of. I am going to be someone that wants to help them and I'm going to act in this helpful role, but I'm not going to reflect their panic. I'm just not going to do it.
I love that. Wendy, I see you nodding to that, right? I mean, what's sort of your final take on this, right? I mean, outcomes. We talked about measurement. We talked about skills. We talked about style, audience, forest for the trees, all that. Being a good human. I mean, what's your final thought on this?
Yeah, I love all of this, right? Outcomes. Let's get there the right way. Let's be a good human. I think part of that is also ideally not just delivering the thing that we're doing, but making sure that thing is ready to continue, move forward, be maintained after we leave. And also that we've built in that organization the muscle to do it again, right? So if we delivered a transformation, can that organization continue transforming, right? Have we helped them to build the capacity? So I think that's, for me, the last bit of really closing the loop on the outcomes. Do it again so they can do it again.
I love that repeatability, right? The whole thing about a science experiment, right? The outcomes of a science experiment are meaningless unless they can be repeated, right, by somebody else, kind of thing. Oliver, I know you've got a session coming up in a few minutes on sustainability. But what are you closing out when you're thinking about this topic?
So I think if it's not clear what the outcomes of something are, then everyone should feel empowered to ask that question. I mean, I'm talking about sustainability and touching on AI a little bit in a bit, but I'm doing an awful lot of R&D in both those areas right now. And one of the things that's become quite apparent to me is if the outcomes aren't clear to everyone working on things like research and development projects, whatever the project is, that's the bottom line. Otherwise, what's the point? If we're not aligned on that, we aren't clear, either as an architect, as a consultant, or as a consultant architect, that for whatever you're doing, what's the point if you're not clear on what the goal is? And unfortunately, some organizations aren't great at setting out what the goal is and what the outcome needs to be.
Yeah, and so I concur with all of that, with everything you guys said. I get a bad rap on a lot of my proposals for including too much planning time and thinking time, right? And it's like, a lot of clients want to just get to the thing. Give me Snowflake. I will then have mastered all my data and I will have analytics. And it's like, no, right? It's like, that's not how it works. And I think getting the outcome is understanding the problem. I don't know how you understand the problem unless you ask the right questions, right? And do it in an empathetic way. Well, listen, guys, I appreciate this. Fairly smooth. I did drop because I don't know if you know, but I had to run out to get some chowder at Billy's Chowder House, conveniently available right off Route 1 in Wells, Maine. Best chowder in the world. thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone who's listening. And by the way, you can hear us or see us at least once a month. You can go to consultantsayingthings.com and you can find us on YouTube. Consultants Saying Things is the name of the channel. And thank you all very much. I'll see you guys next time. Appreciate it. Paul, I'm going to throw it back to you. I mean, we've got a couple minutes left. I don't know if you have any questions or if the audience had any questions. But yeah, I think, listen, thank you guys. And I think this is great. Paul, back to you, Paul. He's not there. It's okay. It's our show now. It's our conference now, right?
We've taken over.
I'm just going to take over. Yeah. Oh, we have the next presenter. No,
not next presenter, next host. So I believe that Paul, who will not live it down, is going to finally take advantage of being on the French Riviera this evening. and he may have left a bit early.
All right. Well,
Good to see
we won't
you,
hold it
Roman.
against him.
Great to see you guys. Great conversation.
What are you talking about? I wouldn't miss them talking for the world.
Hey,
The French Riviera be damned. Now,
He's in the vineyard, with
This is terrible dedication. Oh, man.
I'm out. You guys have amazing. Thank you for the great talk. Thank you, Roman, for taking over.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.